1982 Star Trek II The Wrath of Khan stands far apart from any other Star Trek. From the campy 1960s TV series to the first film, Paramount saw this as a way of creating their own science fiction franchise to compete with 20th Century Fox's Star Wars movies. The 1979 Star Trek The Motion Picture was an enormous disappointment for fans and for the box office. So Paramount decided for a sequel, they wanted to go in a different direction than what creator Gene Roddenberry was pitching at the time. Executives brought in producer Harve Bennett, who had created TV series like $6 Million Man, to take over as the creative producer. Enter Nicholas Meyer, the up-and-coming writer who had just directed a feature film called Time After Time. Meyer really brought on an enthusiasm and an energy that really appealed to the original cast, Harve Bennett, and Paramount. And although he did not receive any on-screen credit, Nicholas Meyer wrote the screenplay and he wrote it at an incredibly fast pace. The original cast got right on board and Paramount greenlit the movie, with a little bit lower budget than anybody thought was possible to make this kind of film. Even after 40 years, Wrath of Khan stands the test of time. Gone were the campy uniforms, cheesy sets, and they were replaced by mature dialogue and a grounding that was far more realistic than anything Star Trek had done before and, honestly, since. So much of that credit belongs to the writer and director. I had the chance to sit down with writer-director Nicholas Meyer about the making of Star Trek II, looking back at what he thinks now after all these years. This interview is much more about the creative process, and it's done from a filmmaker's point of view. This is my interview with Nicholas Meyer about the making of Star Trek II, Wrath of Khan. I would be derelict in my duties to not bring up Star Trek II, Wrath of Khan. I mean, this is the 40th anniversary year, so I don't want to ask too many questions about it, but I remember you saying something about you wanted Kirk to be tactile, holding a real leather-bound book, Tale of Two Cities.
I didn't say it was leather-bound. I just said, why can't he ever read a book? And I was wandering around my own room, and I happened to pull down the one book that everybody knows the first and last lines of. So,
it feels like you got Shatner to play Kirk older than he actually was in real life. Because I think he was about 52 years old at the time, but it feels like he's playing it at 60.
I believe in the original draft of the screenplay, I specified that he was 49.
Really?
Yeah. And Bill said, do we have to specify his actual age? And I have to say, I think he was right. So I just took out the specificity of his age and just left in the fact that he was aging and that they'd stuffed him behind a desk, which was a stupid move.
It feels like he's playing the part older than he was, and not having that specificity makes it more relatable whether you're 45 to 65. So to me, it made perfect sense to not be specific about the age.
Obviously, if I had thought it was crucial, I would have made a stand about it. But you have to pick your battles, and this was not one that this was not a field on which I was willing to die.
They had the paperback on the making of the movie that came out at the time of the release, and I just finished reading that about 2 or 3 months ago. I had no idea how much depth there was to Ricardo Montablan's career.
Oh my God, just look him up on IMDb.
I know. And I think they had the equivalent of IMDb at the back of that book.
The thing that you may be interested to learn is that there is a 40th anniversary book coming out just about the making of The Wrath of Khan.
Yeah, the coffee table book, right? One of the things I think that most people miss, if they're just watching a Star Trek movie, they're missing something that I think made Star Trek II unique. Now, I mean, I like Star Trek, but I would not consider myself a Trekkie in any way. And I think that Star Trek II is a great film, regardless of Star Trek or not. It's just a great
I'm inclined to agree with you. That particular insight, and I go back to my earlier statement that artists are not the best judges of their own work. But I do remember that 20 years ago, I attended a 20th anniversary screening of the movie on the lot at Paramount. And I had not seen it in many years. And I was never a Trekker. I never was. I didn't, when the show was on television when I was very young. I mean, I was in college. Um, I didn't know what to make of it. I never watched it. I think it's safe to say that I missed everything that was cool and good and important about it, because all I could see were the stupid costumes and the cheesy sets and the guy with the pointy ears, and I just kept going. And so I missed the international, interracial cast. I missed women in positions of command. I missed the whole sort of optimistic idea that people of goodwill could come together to solve problems and respectfully. And all of that went right by me. So there I am watching this thing 20 years later. And I thought, this movie is really sui generis. It is a thing unto itself. It exists in its own world. Because I didn't know about Star Trek when I wrote the screenplay, I was writing it, cobbling together different storylines from earlier drafts of things that hadn't by themselves worked, and sort of fiddling with them like a Rubik's Cube, and then writing my dialogue all over it to sort of bind it together. And really trying to explain Star Trek to myself and also to my dad, the shrink, because he had never even heard of it. And that's why it starts off by saying in the 23rd century, because I knew he wouldn't have a clue where he was if I didn't put that in. But it definitely, I love that term sui generis, a thing unto itself. And that's what I took away from it on the 20th viewing. On the 40th viewing, I've taken away other things, because works of art, any work of art, they change as you experience them at different stages of your life. If you read War and Peace when you're 20 years old, War and Peace is not the same novel as it is when you're 40 years old or 60 years old. It changes, you change in relation to it.
That's so true. Like for me, the movie came out when I was 10. I'm now 50. What I get from that movie today is a completely different experience to when I was a kid.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Works of art change as you change. Even looking at the Mona Lisa, you go to the Louvre, you look at it when you're 20, look at it when you're 50. And it something has changed. And by the way, not all works of art necessarily age well. There are some, things that you liked at a certain point and you look at and now you wince and they're inappropriate. How many people, for example, who watched Gone with the Wind in 1939 said, stopped to think, gee, those slaves look awful happy. and then you see it again now and you go, ouch. And Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country, when we made that film, we were absolutely convinced that with the collapse of the Soviet Union, which is what our movie was about, we were all entering a brave, new, wonderful world. And Kirk rather smugly, puts down the conspirators as people who were very frightened of change. Well, it turns out maybe the conspirators knew more than we did, because this world sucks compared when we had the Soviet Union to deal with.
Now, the biggest thing for me about Star Trek II Wrath of Khan that stood out, it's a fairly thin metaphor for a lot of nautical. A lot of people have notated that the uniforms that you had changed. When the thing that's most commonly believed is they were based on British Navy uniforms. Does that sound right?
To some degree, it was based on the shirt that John Wayne wears in Stagecoach when he plays the Ringo Kid. A little bit on the costumes from the original Prisoner of Zenda. They weren't pajamas anymore, that's for sure. I didn't want them running around in Dr. Denton's. The Royal Navy during the Napoleonic Wars was a springboard for my imagination, particularly the C.S. Forrester novels about Captain Hornblower. I thought, well, this is Star Trek is Captain Hornblower in outer space. And that analogy informed my thinking in writing and directing Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan. It was a way in. Having said that, but that wasn't all there was to Star Trek, which had a lot more ambitious things on its mind than just Hornblower in outer space. But it was a way for me to visualize the movie, and also there's a wonderful movie. I didn't even realize it at the time. Many years later, I said, "Oh yeah, The Enemy Below." Robert Mitchum and Kurt Jurgens, Destroyer versus Submarine, directed by Dick Powell, which nobody ever remembers. And
one of the biggest anchors for this nautical theme was James Horner's score. One of the greatest film scores of all time was for Wrath of Khan. I mean, it's one of those ones where you hear that music, you can recite dialogue instantly. There's very few film scores, especially today, where you hear the music, every single word and the pacing of the words, the dialogue feels like notes of music because of how well a job he did.
One definition of film music is that it's like writing music for a ballet where the choreography is already in place. In other words, the film is made and you are brought in typically, not always, but typically at the end to underscore literally and also metaphorically what's going on. And sound always dominates picture. It always dominates picture. If you show a little girl dancing through a field of sunflowers, happy as can be, and you play Chopin's Funeral March underneath it, that girl is going to die of an incurable disease, and the audience will know it. So one cannot speak too highly of what James Horner did for Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan. And he was engaged by me after we, couldn't afford Jerry Goldsmith because Star Trek II was definitely made on the cheap. By the time we got to Star Trek VI, we couldn't afford James Horner anymore because we were always working on the cheap.
I know that I think it was Cliff Idleman who did the score for Undiscovered.
Yes, correct. Originally, I had wanted to do Holst the Planets. When I couldn't afford James Horner, I said, well, let's use Holst. But by the time the Paramount lawyers and the Holst estate got through with each other, the Planets is the cash cow of the Holst estate. And Paramount wanted an exclusive lock on all the rights to the planets. And they thought, you know, what planet are you living on? That is not happening.
Well, that sounds like Paramount to me.
Just movie studios and lawyers and just, owning everything in perpetuity and whatever. I was listening to cassette tapes, audition tapes of different composers, and Horner leapt out at me, and I met with him, and I liked him very, very much. And we had a sort of similar dry sense of humor. We did 3 films together. I said to him, think Debussy, think La Mer. That's what I want. I want it to be like the ocean. And he was familiar with La Mer in the same way that Cliff Idleman was familiar with Firebird. And I said, just that's your jumping off point. And he would come to the house, Horner, and sit at my piano and play, various moments, and we would talk about things. And he's actually in the movie for 2 seconds.
Really? Where?
When everybody is rushing to action stations, I threw him in uniform and he's rushing toward you in costume.
Well, he was just a kid at the time. He was still in his 20s, I believe, wasn't he?
Probably I was late 20s. Yeah.
Yeah, like 29. I think he might have been 29 or 30 when he did that score. And it's just, so you have that very nautical vibe. But the one thing that stands out the most to me was the ultimate metaphor was when the Reliant and the Enterprise are side by side, which makes no logical sense except as a filmmaker to put into people's brain Spanish galleons side by side hammering each other with cannons. And most people are not seeing that because they're just seeing spaceships. I was seeing those are big. I could see the sails. I could see the cannons going. You even put the guys in the underneath the ship setting up the torpedoes. To me, that metaphor rang so true. And I think what most people don't get, I mean, as a filmmaker, the idea is anchor it with reality and the science fiction becomes more relatable. I mean, how much of that was an intention for you?
It's interesting. I certainly grew up watching Errol Flynn, watching Captain Blood, watching the Seahawk, watching even the movie of Captain Horatio Hornblower. And yes, the galleons side by side. Interestingly, or at least interestingly to me, when I was designing the film, I said, the Enterprise engines have to make a noise. And in the original, in the television series, they don't. There isn't a boom, 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 boom. There isn't there's, maybe in science fiction future, the engines are silent. But I said, no, 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 no. And we were sitting in a screening room and I heard the air conditioning unit while we were watching something. But I said, that's what I want. Give me that. And so anywhere you are inside the Enterprise, there is some engine hum going on, which again, following what you're saying, sort of anchors it a little bit to a contemporary reality, if not a future reality. Then I thought, take this logic one step further. There shouldn't be any sound in space at all. So we took out the sound of the spaceships and looked at it without sound. And they looked like models. Once you took away the noise, they just looked pretend. So we had to keep the sound in the exterior scenes as well. And the scene that you're talking about, where they're ripping up the gratings for the torpedo, this is my favorite shot in the movie. This is absolutely my favorite shot. And I knew while I was doing it, and I'd asked for it to be built and everything, that it was ridiculous. That it just was, this made no sense in a sci-fi world, whatever. And I was talking with a friend of mine, a very gifted friend, screenwriter named John McNamara, who wrote the movie Trumbo. And I was saying to him, yeah, I know it's bullshit, but I really had to have it. And he said, what do you mean, bullshit? The electrics were all out. They had to do it all by hand. What was the choice, And I thought this is the perfect example of the collaboration between the artist and the audience. He was meeting me halfway. He figured out, yes, they had to be doing this, and it didn't ever occur to him that there was anything wrong or ridiculous.
He came up with a better justification than you did.
He gave it a justification that I never, he met me halfway.
Again, only because I've become a filmmaker in my life that I noticed this, but I would bet 95% of the people watching that movie have no idea that Kirk and Khan never once actually share the screen. They are never on the set at the same time. Now, could you tell me isn't that actually true that one group was completely done when the other group started? Is that correct?
Oh, I'm sure that's true. I mean, and you just look up the shooting schedule and you'll find out. I wrote the thing, don't ask me how, in 12 days because the schedule was really, really tight. So there were 5 different drafts of different scripts that had come before. Kirk meets his son, Khan, the Genesis Project, Lieutenant Savick, Spock dies. It was all different scripts. And somehow I mushed them together. And as I say, put new dialogue over all of it, start to finish. And in doing it, I don't think I realized until it was finished that Kirk and Khan didn't meet, didn't have a scene together. And I think Shatner wanted some kind of mano a mano, that they should slug it out or something. And I really fought that. I said, no pun intended, but I just thought, I saw them do that in Space Seed. And to me, it was ridiculous. It looked fake. If Khan is a Superman, how is it possible that Kirk wins anyway? That it just felt wrong, and you should pardon the chutzpah, implausible. It felt implausible, ridiculous, and I didn't need it, or at least that's what I argued at the time. Whether I was right or wrong, the proof is in the pudding. Whatever.
There's a scene where they play off each other, which is, through communicator on the bridge. And what I found fascinating was the rhythm and pacing had to have been created entirely in editing. And it's flawless editing in that scene where Kirk and Khan have a conversation, underpinned by James Horner's score, adding that amazing tension to it. But everything about that, like performance-wise, the average viewer doesn't realize those people aren't there together. In fact, I think the Reliant bridge is the Enterprise bridge, just redressed slightly.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it just, to me, can you talk about kind of that editorial process? What was it like for you editing specifically that scene?
Well, I've been honest so far. I'm going to be honest now and tell you that I don't remember. I know that in order to have Khan appear on Kirk's screen, we had to shout, at some point over Kirk's shoulder to Khan, and that meant that we used a big VistaVision camera. This gets into a lot of technical weeds here.
It's a 65 millimeter camera that actually goes sideways.
Yes, and it's the image is very stable, and the camera is really anchored down, so there's no shimmy in the image, because any shimmy would sort of reveal that it make it look inauthentic.
The other thing was, because it was the 65 millimeter frame, when you're compositing it down to 35 millimeter, you're not going to lose generations with that grain. That was the main reason they would use VistaVision cameras at that time.
And the camera that we used had also shot North by Northwest and the 10 Commandments.
Oh, so you shot in true scope.
With the names of its other films. So, yeah.
That's amazing. Yeah, because that was shot in true anamorphic scope, the 2.35 to 1.
Correct.
And that would have been where, because it's anamorphic, the edges would have bowed a little bit, which I think I noticed on a lot of the view.
when I last saw it, I noticed that was true anamorphic. I hope you had a good time.
With
Did
this.
I did, and thank you for your time.
Wrath of Khan is in my top 5 films of all time. The first time I ever saw Wrath of Khan, I was 10 years old. And now that I'm in my 50s, I find myself relating to the story even more now than I did when I first saw it. I never dreamed that in my lifetime I would ever have a conversation with the writer and director of the film. Getting a chance to speak to one of my heroes was absolutely magical. I learned a lot, and this was absolutely a high point for me. I wanted to thank Nicholas Meyer for this opportunity, and I want to make sure I mention that he has a new novel coming out soon called Sherlock Holmes and the Telegram from Hell. I will link in the description to another video I already did about his Sherlock Holmes novels. And I have a third video coming with some more generalized and broad tips about filmmaking that I also did with Nicholas Meyer that I hope will not take 2 years to finish. So thank you guys for watching. Like and subscribe. I guess that's what young people do or say. I don't really care.